We have two endings to our first two readings. One says the word of the Lord, and the other one says, hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. I think it's appropriate to use both. We read the scriptures, of course, for insights into the religious perspectives of those who have come before us in our tradition. We wouldn't really know anything about them without them. In the Hebrew scriptures, and epistles and gospels, the story of the early church in the book of Acts. But these passages, I believe, are also meant to speak to us directly in our own time, in our own discernment of God's present call to us as individual Christians, as a Christian community of the church, as a Christian community in this place here at St. James, whether today or every day. Worldwide, nationwide, in our diocese, in our parish, the church is in a time of significant transition, I believe. Some would say it's in a state of decline. Over the past 100 years in Europe, and probably the past 50 years in the United States, the past 30 years here at St. James, fewer and fewer people are attending church. And even fewer than that are actively involved in the church. But while we certainly welcome any who want to share life with us, and we're more than happy to bring what we find here to those we encounter beyond this place, declining membership in the church as an institution is not necessarily a sign that our calling to be the body of Christ for the world today is being any less fulfilled. At least that's what I think. To see that, we need to understand the symbiotic nature of the culture and the church. Symbiosis means living with, as like when two species live in ongoing specific relationships. Culture and religious institutions in particular, religion in general, culture and church, always live together in some way. The way that I've often phrased this when I'm in discussions with people, particularly people who are not all that affiliated with the church, is that religion, any religion, certainly any world religion, if you use that term, survives very long only in some way being co-opted by the culture in which it's embedded. The culture, the state, the powers of the culture agree not to wipe out the religion, maybe even help it. And the religion, for its part, agrees not to be subversive for the culture, for the state. In fact, very often will take over certain programs of the culture, like family regulation or moral regulation, and also provide a kind of spiritual authority, a divine authority in our case, for the existing secular institutions. At the beginning of Christianity, within the tradition of Judaism, there was simply the event of Jesus that grabbed people and moved them and turned them around. It gave people a spiritual meaning and purpose in life that they hadn't had. It gave them a kind of community that they hadn't experienced. It gave them a sense of being loved and being able to love in a way that they hadn't felt. So from a very few people, the church grew. It didn't take very many people. It just took the right people, I guess. And the church grew and grew and grew and expanded. We heard about its expansion, or at least the justification for its expansion to the Gentile community. And eventually, it found itself in a symbiotic relationship with the Roman Empire. I looked it up online, and I was told that there were 3 kinds of symbiotic relationships. There's a mutualism, where both species benefit from the relationship. I think a good example of that is people and their dogs. The dogs get fed, they get cared for, they get their illnesses treated, and people get that special relationship of closeness and acceptance, total connection, as well as very often some work that dogs will perform from time to time. The second kind of symbiosis is commensalism, where one species, one partner in the relationship gains and the other isn't troubled at all. I think, for example, maybe a burr or a seed or something that gets caught in a dog's fur. It greatly benefits the species of the plant. It spreads it around, but the dog doesn't even know about it, hardly. And the third one is parasitism, like a flea for a dog. The flea benefits, it sucks the blood, but the dog very often is not benefited. I think there's also maybe a flip side to parasitism, where maybe the more dominant species just takes over. Maybe that's like where a mountain lion comes along and eats your dog. I don't know. Really, you can see in churches, in religions, in the history of the church, that same kind of process. Early on, when the church was finally accepted, well, I think before the church was accepted by the Roman Empire, it was seen to be parasitic. It was seen to be a negative influence at various times during what the church called persecutions. The empire attempted to wipe it out. When it was finally accepted, for a while, there was a kind of mutualism where the church survived much more than it had during persecutions. And the empire got divine sanction. Constantine got the support of the Christians. And often, usually though, I think it was more maybe a commensalism where the societies benefited and the church just kept going along. It wasn't really too much affected. I think actually that evolved into assimilation, where the culture really ended up eating the church. The church becomes simply an institution of the culture, an institution of the state. And I think for most of Christian history, that was the condition we were in. Constantine brought the agreeing bishops together at Nicaea, and they ordered the church, and they wrote down what was an acceptable scripture, and they wrote down what was an acceptable belief. And that kind of uniformity was required by Constantine if the church was going to be a part of his monarchical empire. Certain things came in at that point that had not been really a part of Christianity, an emphasis on law and order. behavioral laws were written. All the orders of church ministry were set up. That wasn't really a part of the early church at all. There was, the creeds were written. Heresy began to be prosecuted. In fact, heresy began to be defined for the first time. And where Paul was going out to seek out Christians who were heretical Jews in his early life, as he saw them, pretty soon the church was out looking for heretical Christians, people who didn't have quite the right understanding of Jesus' relationship with God, or people who didn't have quite the right understanding of the sacraments or the positions of a bishop. I was listening to a podcast a couple days ago that featured a woman who is a professor and has specialized in anti-Semitism, the history of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and that sort of thing. And she puts the beginning of anti-Semitism at the time when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, when that diversity and that alternate understanding of spirituality became a threat, and Jews began to be vilified, began to be seen as the other and to be limited and persecuted, and that continued on from there. Assimilation is tricky. It offers access to power that was not possible before. The early church was a church of slaves, of poor people. They were not powerful. They were subject to arrest. Even though some upper-class people supported them, that was not the state for most of the time. People were in danger, but when it became an official religion, it began to have its own power and could exercise it, and that's very seductive. The church maybe originally was based on that Jesus event, on the sense of connection with God in that event, on the sense of love surrounding that event. But somehow power works with people on our fears. We don't think we're abandoning our other values, but we try to hold on to power in order to protect them. We're afraid we'll lose love if we don't exercise power, and yet the power then overcomes the value of love. I talked a little bit about that last week when we talked about the image of the shepherd, and that image and other images that Jesus presented as images of powerlessness as opposed to power. That sense of powerlessness and value of powerlessness went away when the symbiotic relationship between the church and the culture were connected, regardless of whether it was mutualism, commensalism, or parasitism. And that didn't change. I mean, it happened in a certain way in the late Roman Empire, but then in a different way in medieval feudal times, in a different way with the divine right of kings. The history of our own Episcopal Church is very connected to an almost a merging of church and state under the Tudor kings and first Queen Elizabeth. And in our own country, in spite of the fact that much of the motivation of settlement of this country by Europeans, and the English in particular, was based on an escape from that connection between the power of the state and the community of the church. We couldn't resist it. The church, you just look at the society in the 1950s through 1970s. I used to get, I make the bulletin covers now because all the bulletin covers I used to order from the only company that really made them just had these nice Midwestern scrub wasp families on them going to church in ways that, I remember, but not too many other people do. We thought of those times as times of success. We remember those times as the glory days of the church, with big Sunday schools and active youth groups and committees and commissions and tea parties and sherry parties and all sorts of things. Those were really cultural institutions rather than spiritual efforts. There was a merger, and so often the attraction and the involvement within those things shut out much access to spirituality, so that assimilation became kind of the church getting eaten up. It ceases then to be able to provide the spiritual meaning that was at the core of the beginning. It ceases to be something other than economic security, social security. It ceases to be this connecting link to the ultimate, to God, really, and becomes just another club. So that's partly what's changed. And it may very well be that the same number of sincere Christians are going to church today that they were in the 1950s. It's just that all the other people haven't come. That's felt as a loss, and there's a sadness about it in a way. But it may also reorient the church today and the church tomorrow to be what it originally was meant to be. To let go of the power that was given to us by the culture and rediscover then the love that's at our heart. That's what Jesus says in the gospel today. I leave you with a new commandment, to love one another. People will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another. So we are called to let go of our drive for success and wealth and power and influence, and simply begin to follow the command to love again. To love probably first each other in community, and I think that's true here at St. James. We're a quirky group, but I think a loving group. But then we share that love. We share that love out. And sooner or later, people will notice that. The power of the culture, the power of the world, the power of the state has become oppressive and becomes more so every year. And we need to find our meaning not in xenophobia, not in racism, not in nuclear weapons or space forces, but in love. Love for each other, love for the world. And it won't take a lot of people. It won't take a lot of people. Just the right people. Just us. Thanks be to God.